In the quiet lowlands of South Carolina in 1815, two neighboring plantation houses stood in mourning, black dresses, shuttered windows, and the heavy silence left behind by dead husbands. To the outside world, these widows were symbols of dignity and restraint. But after sunset, when candles burned low and servants were sent away, something happened that could never be spoken aloud. A single enslaved man moved between those houses, carrying a secret so dangerous that if discovered, it would destroy not only his life, but theirs as well. Tonight's story is about silence, power, and a truth buried so deep that history almost forgot it. Before we move deeper into this story, remember to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you don't miss these hidden chapters of history, and stay with us until the end, because what begins in silence rarely ends quietly, and in South Carolina in 1815, silence was the most carefully guarded possession of all, especially for women left alone at the top of a system built to collapse without men, because widowhood on a plantation was not merely a personal loss, but a public vulnerability, a condition that exposed the fragile scaffolding beneath Southern respectability. And this was the position Eleanor Whitcomb and Margaret Halloway found themselves in when death removed their husbands within the same year, leaving behind land, wealth, enslaved people, and an unspoken question no one dared to ask aloud: how does a woman maintain authority in a world that only pretends she ever had it? Eleanor's plantation sat closer to the river, a grand but aging house whose white columns bore hairline cracks that no one spoke of, while Margaret's estate lay slightly inland, newer, smaller, but watched more closely by neighbors who measured morality by visibility. And though the two widows were rarely seen together, they were bound by circumstance, mirrored figures navigating the same narrow corridor between propriety and survival, each expected to mourn quietly, dress plainly, reduce social presence, and above all preserve the illusion that nothing essential had changed. Yet everything had, because their husbands had not only been companions but shields, intermediaries between public authority and private need. And without them, the nights grew longer, heavier, filled with sounds that daylight concealed: the settling of wood, the distant calls from the quarters, the relentless echo of empty rooms that had once been filled with male certainty. In daylight, both women performed grief with precision, black dresses pressed, veils drawn low, voices softened to appropriate restraint, accepting condolences from neighbors who watched closely, not out of kindness, but calculation, because in plantation society, widows were evaluated as risks, their estates potential targets, their behavior subject to immediate speculation, and every choice they made, who they spoke to, how often they appeared in public, whether they smiled too quickly or lingered too long, was quietly recorded and judged. Eleanor, older and more reserved, leaned into ritual, maintaining strict schedules, reinforcing hierarchy among the enslaved, and insisting on order as a substitute for certainty, while Margaret, younger and less practiced in concealment, oscillated between isolation and restless control, walking her grounds at dusk, issuing instructions twice, correcting small errors with unnecessary sharpness, both women attempting in different ways to anchor themselves to authority that felt suddenly unstable. Yet for all their effort, night remained their enemy, because night stripped away performance, leaving behind thought, memory, and the unbearable awareness of absence. And it was in those hours, when visitors were gone and servants dismissed to their quarters, that the true cost of widowhood emerged, not as desire but as exposure. The exposure of being alone in houses built for dominance, surrounded by labor they commanded but could not con. Fied in, protected by laws that favored them yet offered no comfort. And it was within this tension that the conditions for secrecy were formed, not through intention but necessity. Because when systems deny legitimate outlets for human need, those needs do not disappear, they reroute. Eleanor and Margaret did not speak of loneliness to one another, because acknowledgement would imply weakness, and weakness invited intervention, yet both felt it acute, admitted it even to herself, because Isaiah did not arrive in their lives as a figure of desire or defiance, but as a solution to problems their husbands had once absorbed without notice, a steady pair of hands, and a mind quick enough to anticipate needs before they were spoken, and this usefulness, this quiet competence, was what first altered the balance. For Isaiah was trusted with errands that required discretion, messages carried between properties under the pretense of efficiency, repairs checked after dark to avoid disrupting daytime routines, and with each task completed without incident, the boundary between necessity and reliance grew thinner. Eleanor, who had once insisted on strict hierarchies and clear chains of command, found herself asking Isaiah questions she would previously have directed to overseers, not because she trusted him more in theory, but because in practice he listened, absorbed instruction without judgment, and returned results without complication. And that simplicity was a relief she had not realized she was seeking, while Margaret, more visibly restless, began requesting Isaiah's presence during evening hours, when her thoughts raced faster than daylight could restrain, telling herself that supervision after sunset was prudent, that a widow had the right to protect her property at all hours, even as she became increasingly aware of how his quiet attention steadied her, grounding her in moments when her authority felt like an ill-fitting garment she wore out of obligation rather than confidence. Isaiah himself understood the danger of visibility and practiced restraint with care, never lingering unless instructed, never initiating conversation beyond what was required, because survival for an enslaved man in such proximity to power depended not on boldness but on predictability, and yet even predictability can become conspicuous when it replaces absence, and absence had become the defining feature of both households. The widow's neighbors noticed little at first, because what they expected to see was decline, widows growing frail, estates slowly mismanaged, women retreating into piety, and instead they saw continuity, plantations running smoothly, finances maintained, no outward sign of disorder, and this reassured them enough to stop looking closely, a mistake born of arrogance, because they assumed the control flowed downward naturally, never considering that it might be quietly negotiated in private spaces beyond their gaze. Within those spaces, Eleanor and Margaret began to experience a subtle shift in how they perceived Isaiah, not as property, but as presence, not as a role, but as a constant. And that shift, though never named, carried consequences, because it disrupted the internal narratives they relied on to justify their lives, narratives that required clear divisions between ruler and ruled, subject and object, and when those divisions blurred even slightly, the mind scrambled to restore them through rationalization, telling itself that attention was merely attentiveness, that trust was merely efficiency, that the warmth of another human being in a silent room was merely coincidence, yet the body, less obedient to ideology, registered these moments differently, responding to tone, posture, shared silence, the subtle acknowledgement that passed without words. When Isaiah anticipated a need before it was spoken, Eleanor noticed it first in herself as irritation, a sudden discomfort when Isaiah was absent longer than expected, an unwelcome awareness of how empty the house felt without the rhythm of his steps moving through its corridors, and she corrected this by tightening rules, by reminding herself of her position, by reducing unnecessary contact, only to find that the discipline brought no relief, because what unsettled her was not proximity but recognition, the recognition that her authority felt more secure when mediated through someone who understood its fragility, while Margaret experienced the shift as restlessness, a heightened awareness of time that made nights feel endless unless filled with purpose, and she began assigning tasks that required explanation, not because the tasks demanded it, but because the explanations did, allowing her to speak aloud thoughts that would otherwise circle endlessly in her mind. Isaiah listening without interruption, absorbing her words as part of the work, offering nothing that could be construed as opinion, and in that silence she found space to breathe, to articulate fears she could not voice to her peers, because widowhood in plantation society permitted sorrow but not uncertainty, strength but not doubt. The enslaved community observed these developments with a mixture of caution and calculation, understanding instinctively that Isaiah's shifting role carried risk not only for him but for all of them, because when lines blur at the top, consequences often cascade downward, and so they watched closely, ready to intervene with silence or misdirection if needed, because survival had taught them that secrets were communal assets, not individual indulgences, and that protection, when possible, must be collective. Yet even with such awareness, the change continued, because it was not driven by intent, but by emotional gravity, the pull of shared solitude drawing disparate lives into closer orbit, and as the widow's dependence deepened, so too did their internal conflict, because each moment of comfort was followed by a surge of self-reproach, a reminder of the system they upheld, the violence it required, and the impossibility of reconciling their private relief with their public roles, leading Eleanor to retreat into moral rigidity during daylight hours, enforcing discipline with renewed severity as if to compensate for the ambiguity she felt at night, while Margaret oscillated between indulgence and denial, sometimes avoiding Isaiah entirely, other times summoning him repeatedly under flimsy pretexts, unable to settle into either distance or acceptance. Isaiah bore these fluctuations with practiced neutrality, aware that consistency was his only protection, yet internally he marked each shift, understanding that unpredictability at this level signaled approaching danger, because intimacy without acknowledgement breeds fear, and fear, when possessed by those in power, often seeks release through control. Still, the bond, if it could be called that, persisted, shaped less by desire than by mutual need for stability in a world that offered neither, and it was this mutuality, however asymmetrical, that made the situation volatile, because it challenged the foundational lie of the plantation system, that those at the top were self-sufficient, complete, and unaffected by those beneath them. And once that lie cracks, even slightly, it threatens to expose everything built upon it. By the end of that second year, the widows found themselves standing at a threshold they could sense but not define, aware that something essential had changed, yet unwilling to trace its outline, choosing instead to move forward as they had been, trusting habit to carry them through, unaware that habit, when built on silence, does not preserve equilibrium, but accelerates transformation, and that what had begun as quiet reliance was steadily becoming something else, something that would soon demand choices they had spent their lives avoiding, choices that could not be justified by grief alone. And as the Carolina nights grew heavier with summer heat, the spaces between Eleanor, Margaret, and Isaiah narrowed further, not through dramatic gestures but through accumulated moments, each one insignificant on its own, together forming a path that could no longer be retraced without consequence, setting the stage for a secret that would soon cease to be accidental and begin to define them all. By the time the third year unfolded, the unspoken arrangement that had formed around Eleanor Whitcomb, Margaret Halloway, Anne D. Isaiah had begun to acquire a gravity of its own, no longer dependent on grief as its sole explanation, but sustained by a routine that felt increasingly deliberate, even as all three participants avoided acknowledging it as such. Because acknowledgement would have required moral language that none of them were prepared to use, and so they continued forward under the illusion of inevitability, telling themselves that circumstances had simply aligned this way, that proximity had been unavoidable, that nothing truly improper had occurred. Yet the very effort required to maintain that belief revealed how fragile it had become. Eleanor, ever more aware of her internal contradictions, began experiencing her reliance on Isaiah as a kind of failure, not of discipline but of identity, because she had been raised to understand authority as something innate, something that flowed naturally from lineage and law, and the realization that her sense of stability now depended on another person's presence unsettled her deeply, prompting her to retreat further into formality during the day, reinforcing rules, correcting perceived slights with excessive precision, and insisting on visible hierarchy as if repetition might restore certainty, while at night she found herself listening for Isaiah's movements with an attentiveness she resented, measuring time by his arrival and departure, and chastising herself for the relief she felt when his tasks extended longer than expected. Margaret, by contrast, experienced the deepening dynamic as an internal fracture, torn between her desire to assert independence and her growing awareness that independence, as defined by plantation society, was a fiction sustained only through male intermediaries, And Isaiah had become one such intermediary, though in a form that defied public recognition, and this contradiction manifested in her behavior as oscillation, days of rigid distance followed by nights of sudden summons, her voice sharp one evening, subdued the next, testing boundaries without articulating them, because testing allowed her to feel control without committing to transgression. Isaiah navigated these shifts with increasing caution, aware that the widow's emotional volatility signaled a narrowing margin for error, because what had once been quiet reliance was now tinged with expectation, and expectation, when unmet, breeds resentment, a dangerous emotion when held by those who wield absolute power, and so he adjusted his behavior subtly, arriving promptly, speaking only when addressed, maintaining a composed reliance on Isaiah, who moved between these spaces as both connector and buffer, carrying information, smoothing transitions, absorbing tension without release. The emotional landscape grew more complex, because what bound them now was not simply need but shared risk, the unspoken understanding that exposure would devastate all involved, albeit in profoundly unequal ways, and this shared risk fostered a fragile sense of mutual recognition, moments when eyes met a fraction too long, when instructions softened, when silence stretched beyond necessity, laden with awareness that could not be named. Eleanor began to experience a moral fatigue that no amount of discipline could dispel, a sense that her efforts to uphold the system were increasingly hollow, because the system itself demanded contradictions she could no longer reconcile internally, and this fatigue manifested as withdrawal, fewer public engagements, longer periods spent alone, and an almost ritualistic adherence to routine that felt less like order and more like containment, while Margaret, more emotionally transparent, began to experience episodes of acute anxiety, nights when sleep eluded her and thoughts spiraled toward imagined futures she could not control, futures in which secrets surfaced, reputations collapsed, and authority evaporated. And it was during these nights that Isaiah's presence became most significant, not as comfort in any overt sense, but as anchor, a living reminder that the present moment could be endured, that chaos had not yet arrived. Isaiah, for his part, grappled with a growing awareness of his own precarious position, understanding that his value to the widows was both his protection and his greatest danger, because dependency can quickly turn to resentment when those in power feel their autonomy threatened, and he began to contemplate contingencies, small adjustments that might allow him to step back without provoking suspicion, though he knew that withdrawal itself could trigger the very scrutiny he sought to avoid, because absence would be noticed now, interpreted as disruption rather than normalcy. The dynamic reached a critical tension, not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulation, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing against the limits of silence, and it was during this period that the widows began, independently and without coordination, to articulate justifications to themselves that went beyond grief, telling themselves that their reliance on Isaiah was a matter of efficiency, of necessity, of pragmatic management, arguments that grew more elaborate as their emotional stakes deepened, because the more they needed these justifications, the more fragile they were becoming. The system around them continued to function outwardly, crops planted and harvested, accounts balanced, rituals observed, but beneath this surface lay a shifting foundation, because authority exercised under emotional strain does not remain static. It warps, bending toward control in some areas and abdication in others, and this warping created inconsistencies that could not remain invisible forever. By the close of this phase, the relationship between Eleanor, Margaret, and Isaiah had transformed from incidental reliance into an unacknowledged triangle of dependence, fear, and mutual silence, each participant acutely aware that they were no longer operating within the bounds of their assigned roles, yet equally aware that retreat would require confronting truths none of them were prepared to face, and so they continued forward, step by careful step, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, while internally bracing for a reckoning they could sense approaching but could not yet define, because the most dangerous moment in any secret is not its creation, but the point at which it becomes necessary, and that point was drawing steadily closer, reshaping their lives in ways that would soon demand more than silence to sustain. as the fourth-year presse. D forward, the fragile equilibrium that had sustained Eleanor Whitcomb, Margaret Halloway, and Isaiah entered a phase where restraint itself became labor, exhausting in its constancy. Because what had once been managed through silence now required active maintenance, deliberate choices to avoid certain paths, even as those paths presented themselves with increasing frequency. And this labor reshaped each of them in ways that were subtle but cumulative, altering posture, tone, and decision-making until the strain seeped into every corner of plantation life. Eleanor, increasingly conscious that her authority felt performative rather than inherent, responded by tightening control over appearances, insisting on impeccable order in public-facing spaces, while privately retreating from decisions that required emotional investment, delegating more responsibility to overseers she did not fully trust, and compensating for that distrust by issuing written instructions that left little room for interpretation, a strategy that reassured her sense of command but isolated her further, because paperwork cannot replace presence, and presence was precisely what she had been avoiding acknowledging in Isaiah, whose steady reliability now contrasted sharply with the inconsistencies of men she had once assumed were indispensable. Margaret, by contrast, experienced the period as an intensification of inner conflict, her attempts to assert independence colliding with the reality that her stability depended on rhythms she could neither fully control nor publicly defend, leading her to oscillate between bursts of decisiveness, reorganizing schedules, altering long-standing routines, asserting authority in ways that drew attention, and periods of withdrawal marked by silence and sleeplessness, during which the house seemed to amplify her isolation. And it was in these oscillations that Isaiah's role became most precarious, because he was increasingly called upon to absorb the emotional residue of decisions he had no power to influence, tasked with executing orders that shifted without explanation, and expected to do so without reaction, because reaction itself could be misinterpreted as familiarity. The enslaved community responded to this heightened volatility by reinforcing informal networks of communication, sharing observations quietly, adjusting movements to minimize exposure, and ensuring that Isaiah was never positioned alone in circumstances that might invite scrutiny, because they understood that protection required anticipation, not reaction, and that once attention focused on a single individual, it rarely remained contained. Yet even with such precautions, the atmosphere grew heavier, because secrets do not remain static. They accumulate weight, and weight seeks release. Neighbors began to interpret the widow's behavior through the lens of rumor, not because they possessed evidence, but because plantation society thrived on speculation, particularly where women's authority was concerned, and subtle deviations from expectation, Margaret's irregular attendance at church, Eleanor's reduced hospitality, were enough to generate narratives that circulated quietly, never voiced directly but shaping perception, and these narratives increased the pressure on the widows to demonstrate conformity, to reassure their peers that order remained intact, prompting gestures of exaggerated propriety that felt hollow even as they served their purpose. Within this climate, Isaiah became both more visible and more constrained, his movements scrutinized not overtly but through casual observation, glances held a moment too long, questions asked with feigned innocence, and he responded by narrowing his routines further, limiting interactions to what could be justified as necessity, even as necessity itself had expanded to encompass tasks that once would have been handled by others, a paradox that heightened his risk. Because indispensability attracts attention as surely absence. Eleanor sensed this danger and experienced it as a tightening in her chest, an awareness that her reliance had consequences beyond her own discomfort. Yet she struggled to translate that awareness into action, because any attempt to reduce Isaiah's role threatened to destabilize the fragile systems she had constructed to manage her own uncertainty. And so she delayed, telling herself that the moment was not yet right, that circumstances would resolve themselves, a familiar refrain that masked avoidance. Margaret, more emotionally attuned to the cost of delay, found herself increasingly haunted by imagined outcomes, envisioning futures in which a single misstep unraveled everything, and this anxiety drove her toward control, not withdrawal, leading her to impose stricter oversight on the plantation, to involve herself in details she had previously ignored, and to summon Isaiah more frequently under the guise of coordination, a pattern that intensified their proximity even as it heightened her fear. Because proximity now carried the dual weight of comfort and risk, Isaiah, caught between these opposing impulses, began to experience a quiet erosion of self, not through overt harm but through the constant necessity of self-monitoring, of calibrating every gesture, every pause, every word to avoid misinterpretation. A vigilance that left little space for interiority, because reflection itself could be dangerous when it led to questions with no safe answers. And yet even within this vigilance, moments of recognition occurred, fleeting acknowledgments of shared humanity that passed without words, exchanged through posture or silence. Moments that could not be erased, and that made the effort to maintain distance feel increasingly artificial. The plantation system, predicated on rigid hierarchies and clear roles, was ill-equipped to contain such ambiguities, and as these ambiguities multiplied, they manifested in operational inconsistencies, conflicting orders, delayed decisions, uneven enforcement, that rippled outward, affecting productivity and morale. And though these effects were attributed publicly to weather or market fluctuations, those closest to the ground understood that the cause lay elsewhere. In the tension radiating from the top, Eleanor attempted to counteract this by staging displays of authority, hosting gatherings that showcased order and prosperity, inviting neighbors to observe the plantation's smooth functioning. And these events achieved their immediate goal, quieting speculation, but they exacted a personal toll. Because performing certainty required energy she no longer possessed in abundance, leaving her drained and irritable in their aftermath, more reliant than ever on the controlled calm Isaiah provided during the cleanup. The quiet hours when guests had departed and masks could be loosened slightly. Margaret, observing these efforts, felt both relief and resentment. Relief that scrutiny had been deflected, resentment that deflection required such performance, and this ambivalence deepened her internal divide, leading her to question not only her circumstances but the values that had shaped them, questions she could not articulate publicly and barely allowed herself to consider privately, because to question the system was to question her place within it, and that was a destabilizing prospect she was not yet prepared to face. Isaiah perceived these shifts and adjusted accordingly, understanding that the widow's internal struggles were approaching a point where silence alone would no longer suffice, and he began to prepare mentally for outcomes he could not control, recognizing that his survival depended not only on his own actions, but on the decisions of others, decisions shaped by fear, desire, and social pressure, forces far more volatile than any individual intent. As the season turned and the nights grew longer, the sense of impending change intensified, not as a single looming event, but as a pervasive atmosphere, a feeling that the margins for error were shrinking, that each choice now carried amplified consequences, and within this atmosphere, the unspoken bond between Eleanor, Margaret, and Isaiah took on a new quality, less accidental, more conscious, because awareness itself had become unavoidable, and with awareness came responsibility. The question of what to do with knowledge that could no longer be denied, they did not yet answer that question, but its presence altered everything, infusing their interactions with a gravity that made even mundane exchanges feel charged. And it was this gravity that marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, because once a secret is fully recognized by those who hold it, it ceases to be merely a circumstance and becomes a choice, and choices, once acknowledged, demand reckoning, setting the stage for decisions that would test the limits of loyalty, fear, and the fragile illusions that had sustained them thus far. As the fifth phase unfolded, the secret that had once survived on instinct and restraint now demanded intention, because the atmosphere of inevitability that had been building could no longer be ignored without consequence. And Eleanor Whitcomb and Margaret Halloway each reached a point where avoidance began to feel more dangerous than acknowledgement, though neither was prepared to articulate that acknowledgement aloud. And so they moved forward cautiously, each attempting in her own way to shape the situation into something manageable, something that could be controlled without being named. Eleanor approached this shift through rationalization, telling herself that what had developed was not emotional dependence, but a practical arrangement necessitated by circumstance. And she began to formalize Isaiah's role in subtle ways, assigning him responsibilities that could be documented, tasks that provided visible justification for his continued presence in her private spaces, believing that structure would neutralize ambiguity. Yet this effort had the opposite effect, because formalization made the relationship more visible, more legible to those who watched for patterns, and in attempting to protect herself from internal conflict, she inadvertently increased external risk. Margaret, sensing this danger intuitively, responded by retreating from overt reliance while deepening private connection, reducing Isaiah's public duties on her plantation while increasing the frequency of quiet, late-hour consultations, framed as necessity, but driven by an urgent need for grounding, a need that had grown sharper as her anxiety intensified. And this divergence in strategy created a new layer of tension, because Isaiah now found himself navigating not only the emotional volatility of each widow, but the inconsistencies between them, carrying expectations that could not be reconciled without exposing the very thing they all sought to conceal. Isaiah understood that this stage was the most perilous yet, because secrets rarely collapse under scrutiny alone. They collapse under contradiction, and the widow's differing approaches threatened to generate precisely the kind of inconsistency that invited investigation, and so he adjusted again, attempting to harmonize their expectations through careful timing, limiting his presence where it could be observed and concentrating it where it could be concealed, a balancing act that demanded constant calculation and left little room for error. The enslaved community, ever alert to shifts in power, recognized the increased danger and responded by tightening their protective circle, coordinating movements, offering plausible explanations when questions arose, and subtly redirecting attention away from Isaiah whenever possible, because they understood that his fate was intertwined with theirs, that any upheaval at the top would ripple downward with unpredictable violence, and that collective silence remained their strongest defense. Yet even with these efforts, the emotional intensity of the situation began to manifest in ways that could not be fully controlled, because Eleanor and Margaret were no longer merely reacting to circumstances. They were making choices shaped by desire for stability, connection, and control, and those choices carried moral weight that pressed heavily on their consciences, leading Eleanor to experience bouts of self-reproach that she attempted to expel through renewed displays of authority, enforcing discipline with a severity that unsettled even those accustomed to her strictness, while Margaret, racked by guilt and fear, alternated between tenderness and distance, her behavior unpredictable, her moods shifting without warning, creating an environment in which everyone around her walked carefully, attuned to cues that might signal the need for withdrawal or engagement. Isaiah absorbed these fluctuations silently, aware that any visible reaction could be misread. Yet internally he grappled with the knowledge that the widow's emotional needs were drawing him into a role that no amount of caution could render safe, because his presence now fulfilled functions that extended beyond labor, functions the system explicitly denied him the right to occupy, and this awareness sharpened his sense of vulnerability, prompting him to consider the possibility that survival might eventually require separation. Even if that separation came at great cost, the widows, for their part, began to experience moments of clarity that cut through their justifications, fleeting but undeniable recognitions of the imbalance inherent in their situation, the realization that whatever comfort they derived from Isaiah's presence was inseparable from the power they wielded over his life, and this recognition fueled cycles of guilt and denial, because to confront it fully would have required them to question the foundations of their authority, a prospect that threatened not only their social standing but their sense of self. The broader plantation community felt the effects of this internal turmoil as routines grew increasingly inconsistent, decisions delayed or reversed, punishments meted out unevenly, and though no single incident drew attention, the cumulative effect was a sense of instability that unsettled both overseers and enslaved people, creating an undercurrent of tension that permeated daily life, making everyone more cautious, more alert, more aware that something fundamental was shifting. Neighbors, ever sensitive to signs of weakness, resumed their quiet surveillance, noting changes in behavior, speculating privately, and positioning themselves to respond should opportunity arise. Because plantation society thrived on opportunism masked as propriety, and widows, despite their wealth, remained vulnerable to intervention under the guise of concern, Eleanor sensed this renewed scrutiny and responded with calculated displays of respectability, attending gatherings, reaffirming alliances, and presenting herself as the embodiment of controlled authority. Yet these performances left her increasingly hollow, because they required the suppression of doubts that had grown too large to ignore, while Margaret, less adept at such performances, withdrew further, allowing Eleanor to serve as a buffer between her estate and public judgment, a reliance that added another layer to their already complex dynamic. Isaiah, moving between these shifting strategies, became acutely aware that the space for neutrality was closing, that his role as silent facilitator could not be sustained indefinitely without resolution, because the emotional stakes for the widows had escalated beyond what silence alone could contain, and resolution, in this context, could only take forms that threatened him directly as the season wore on. The sense of approaching reckoning intensified, not as a single impending event, but as a tightening of possibilities, a narrowing of paths until only difficult. Choices remained, and within this narrowing, the secret ceased to be merely a shared silence and became a force that shaped decisions, constrained options, and demanded recognition, marking the end of a period defined by avoidance and the beginning of one in which consequences could no longer be deferred, because when a secret becomes central to the functioning of a system, it inevitably destabilizes that system, and the plantations, already strained by grief, gendered vulnerability, and social scrutiny, now stood on the edge of transformation, poised between preservation and collapse, with Isaiah caught at the center of a dynamic that had grown far larger than any of them had intended or could control. By the sixth stage, the tension that had been tightening around Eleanor Whitcomb, Margaret Halloway, and Isaiah crossed an invisible threshold, shifting from something managed through vigilance into something that actively shaped every decision they made, because the secret was no longer simply present in their lives, it was directing them, narrowing their options, and demanding compromises that left none of them unchanged. And this realization, though never spoken aloud, altered the emotional climate with a sharpness that could be felt in every interaction. Eleanor, whose instinct had always been to impose structure on uncertainty, began to experience the limits of that strategy, because the more she attempted to regulate appearances, the more aware she became that appearances were now fragile constructions dependent on continued silence, and silence, once weaponized for preservation, began to feel like a trap of her own making, compelling her to choose caution over conscience again and again, a pattern that exhausted her and eroded the sense of moral clarity she had once prized. Margaret, increasingly aware that time was no longer neutral, felt the pressure as urgency, a sense that delay itself was a decision with consequences she could not predict, and this urgency manifested in heightened emotional intensity, moments when her composure fractured and she spoke too freely, followed by periods of abrupt withdrawal marked by shame and fear, because she understood, perhaps more clearly than Eleanor, that whatever bond had formed was inseparable from the imbalance of power that defined their world, and that recognition haunted her, not as abstract guilt, but as a visceral awareness that she was complicit in sustaining a system that denied Isaiah agency, even as it drew upon his presence for stability. Isaiah perceived this shift immediately, because emotional urgency in those who hold power is rarely a private matter. It radiates outward, altering tone, timing, and expectation, and he understood that the margin for misinterpretation had narrowed dangerously, that even small deviations from routine could now be read as intent, and so he redoubled his caution, limiting his movements, adhering strictly to instructions, and minimizing his visibility wherever possible, even as this withdrawal risked destabilizing the very arrangements that had come to depend on his involvement. The enslaved community, sensing the increased volatility, responded with heightened coordination, sharing information more deliberately, adjusting schedules to ensure Isaiah was never isolated without purpose, and preparing contingencies for rapid response should scrutiny intensify, because experience had taught them that when those at the top feel threatened, repercussions often fall hardest on those below, and collective preparedness was the only defense. External pressure continued to mount subtly, neighbors posing questions framed as concern, overseers seeking clarification on inconsistent directives, and minor disputes escalating more quickly than before, all signs that the system's internal strain was becoming visible, and Eleanor, aware of these signals, found herself torn between asserting control and retreating from decision-making altogether, oscillate in between decisive action and paralyzing hesitation, a pattern that confused those who relied on her authority and further undermined the stability she sought to project. Margaret, watching this oscillation, felt both empathy and frustration, recognizing her own reflection in Eleanor's struggle while resenting the burden of shared secrecy that now bound them, and this ambivalence deepened her sense of isolation because there was no space within their society for honest conversation about vulnerability, no language that could safely articulate the intersection of grief, power, and need, leaving her trapped between roles she could perform but not inhabit authentically. Isaiah, caught between these shifting emotional currents, began to experience a profound sense of dislocation, aware that his identity within the system had become increasingly ambiguous, valued for his reliability yet denied recognition beyond utility, depended upon yet perpetually at risk, and this ambiguity weighed on him heavily because it underscored the fundamental injustice of his position, an injustice that no amount of careful behavior could mitigate, and as his awareness deepened, so too did his resolve to preserve his own survival by whatever means remained available. Even as those means narrowed, moments of confrontation hovered at the edges of daily life, not erupting but threatening, a sharp tone here, a lingering look there, reminders that the emotional equilibrium was fraying, and it was during this period that the widows began to recognize, however reluctantly, that the situation could not continue indefinitely without some form of resolution, though what that resolution might look like remained terrifyingly unclear, because every possible outcome carried loss, for them, for Isaiah, and for those whose lives were entangled with his. Eleanor contemplated reducing Isaiah's role drastically, imagining that distance might restore order, yet she understood that such a move would raise questions, disrupt routines, and potentially provoke exactly the scrutiny she feared, while Margaret considered confiding in someone she trusted, only to realize that trust itself was compromised by the social structures that rewarded exposure and punished deviation, leaving her without safe confidants. Isaiah, observing these internal debates from the outside, understood that the decision-making power rested entirely with the widows, and that his fate would be determined by forces beyond his control, a realization that sharpened his sense of urgency and fueled a quiet determination to remain adaptable, to read signs carefully, and to act swiftly should the need arise, because survival in such conditions depended not on hope but on preparedness. The plantations continued to function, crops tended, accounts balanced, rituals observed, yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a pervasive tension that affected everyone, making movements cautious, conversations measured, and silence more pronounced, as if the entire environment had become attuned to the unspoken, and this collective sensitivity intensified the pressure on the secret's holders, because when many sense that something is wrong, even without knowing what it is, the risk of discovery increases exponentially. By the end of this phase, it was clear to all three in their own ways that the path they had been following could not extend much further without decisive action, that the secret had reached a point where it demanded transformation rather than maintenance. And this realization marked a turning point, because it shifted the question from how to preserve the present to how to confront the future, a future fraught with uncertainty, fear, and the possibility of irreversible change, setting the stage for choices that would test not only their resolve, but the very foundations of the world they inhabited. As the seventh phase began, The awareness that had been building finally crystallized into a shared, if still, unspoken understanding that preservation was no longer the same as survival, and that the careful balancing act which had sustained Eleanor Whitcomb, Margaret Halloway, and Isaiah had reached a point where inertia itself posed the greatest danger. Because systems under strain do not collapse from sudden shocks alone, but from prolonged contradiction, and the contradiction at the heart of their lives, authority sustained by dependence, control entwined with vulnerability, had become too pronounced to ignore. Eleanor felt this shift as a quiet but relentless pressure, a sense that every decision now reverberated beyond its immediate context, forcing her to confront the reality that her power, once assumed to be absolute, was contingent not only on law and property, but on the compliance and silence of those beneath her, a realization that unsettled her deeply, because it dismantled the moral scaffolding she had relied upon to justify her position, and in response she found herself increasingly reflective, revisiting memories of her upbringing, the lessons she had absorbed about order and hierarchy, and recognizing for the first time how much of her identity had been constructed around roles she had never chosen but simply inherited. Margaret experienced the same realization as urgency sharpened into resolve, a narrowing of focus that stripped away distraction and left only the essential question of what she was willing to risk in order to stop living in a state of constant fear, because the emotional cost of secrecy had begun to outweigh its perceived benefits, manifesting in sleepless nights, brittle interactions, and a growing sense that she was becoming someone she did not recognize. And this recognition, painful as it was, planted the seed of change, because it forced her to consider the possibility that maintaining respectability at all costs might not be the same as preserving dignity. Isaiah, observing these internal transformations, understood that the widows were approaching a point of decision, and while he could not predict the outcome, he recognized that his own survival depended on anticipating the direction of their choices, because moments of transition are the most dangerous for those without power, when old routines dissolve and new ones have not yet formed. And so he heightened his attentiveness, reading tone and timing with even greater care, noting shifts in demeanor that suggested contemplation rather than avoidance, and preparing himself mentally for outcomes he could not influence but might need to respond to swiftly. The enslaved community sensed the change as well, not through explicit signals, but through the atmosphere itself, a tautness that settled over the plantations like an approaching storm, prompting whispered conversations, quiet planning, and a collective readiness that had been honed through generations of navigating uncertainty, because they knew that when those at the top reached moments of reckoning, the consequences often spilled outward unpredictably. External pressures continued to loom, neighbors more inquisitive, overseers more insistent on clarity, and small disruptions more likely to escalate, creating a backdrop against which any misstep could be amplified, and this heightened scrutiny narrowed the widows' options further, forcing them to consider not only what they wanted, but what could be defended, what could be concealed, and what might be sacrificed to preserve the rest. Eleanor grappled with the possibility that true control might require relinquishment rather than enforcement, a notion that ran counter to everything she had been taught, yet lingered in her thoughts with growing insistence, because she could no longer deny that her attempts to tighten authority had only increased instability, and this realization led her to contemplate a form of restraint that went beyond silence, a deliberate choice to limit her reach, to reduce the scope of decisions that entangled her emotion, even if doing so meant accepting vulnerability in areas she had once guarded fiercely. Margaret, more openly confrontational with her own fears, began to consider the radical idea that secrecy need not be indefinite, that an endpoint, however uncertain, might offer relief from the corrosive effects of constant concealment, and though she did not yet know what form that endpoint could take, the mere act of imagining it altered her posture, lending her a steadiness that had been absent, because hope, even tentative, can counterbalance fear when fear has grown too heavy to carry alone. Isaiah, sensing this emerging resolve, felt a complex mixture of apprehension and cautious optimism, because, while any change carried risk, stagnation had become its own threat, and he understood that his best chance lay not in clinging to the fragile arrangements of the present, but in remaining adaptable, ready to respond to shifts with clarity rather than panic, drawing on the resilience that had sustained him through years of navigating systems designed to deny him agency. Moments of unspoken acknowledgement began to occur more frequently, not as overt exchanges, but as subtle recognitions in posture, timing, and restraint, indications that all three were aware of the precipice they approached, and that whatever lay ahead would require choices that could no longer be deferred, and these moments, though fleeting, carried a gravity that reshaped interactions, making them more deliberate, less reactive, as if each person were conserving energy for what was to come. The plantations themselves seemed to mirror this anticipation, routines continuing but with an undercurrent of pause, decisions held a moment longer, actions taken with greater deliberation, as though the entire environment were holding its breath, waiting for a signal that would determine the next direction, and within this suspended state, the question of responsibility loomed large, because each participant understood, in their own way, that the outcome would not be shared equally, that the risks borne by Isaiah far exceeded those faced by the widows, and this awareness weighed differently on each of them, fueling Eleanor's introspection, Margaret's resolve, and Isaiah's vigilance. By the end of this phase, it was evident that the secret had transformed from a force of containment into a catalyst for change, compelling those who held it to confront not only their circumstances but the values that had guided their lives. And while the shape of the future remained uncertain, one truth had become clear. Continuing as they had been was no longer possible, because the cost of silence had surpassed the cost of decision, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would redefine not only their relationships but their understanding of power, agency, and the limits of control within a world built on inequality. As the final phase unfolded, the long-held tension resolved not through a single dramatic act, but through a series of deliberate choices that unfolded quietly, shaped by the understanding that endings, like secrets, rarely announce themselves, and that survival within unjust systems often depends on timing rather than triumph, because Eleanor Whitcomb and Margaret Halloway, having reached the limits of avoidance, began to act with a clarity born not of certainty but of acceptance, the acceptance that whatever they chose would carry loss, and that the measure of their decision would lie not in preserving appearances but in limiting harm. Eleanor moved first, though her action was subtle, a recalibration rather than a rupture, as she gradually disentangled Isaiah from the routines that placed him in her private spaces, redistributing responsibilities with careful explanation, framing the changes as administrative efficiency rather than reaction, aware that abrupt shifts would invite scrutiny. And this withdrawal, though painful, carried a quiet resolve because it marked her first company. Anxious act of restraint, not motivated by fear, but by recognition of responsibility, the understanding that her reliance, however unintentional, had placed Isaiah in jeopardy she could no longer justify. Margaret followed with a different strategy, one shaped by her growing resolve to end the cycle of secrecy, choosing to reduce dependency not by dispersal but by distance, arranging for Isaiah's reassignment to tasks that placed him beyond the immediate orbit of both plantations, coordinating with Eleanor to ensure continuity and plausibility, a maneuver that required trust between the two widows that had been forged through years of shared silence. And this coordination, though understated, represented a profound shift because it replaced isolation with collaboration, secrecy with strategy, and fear with intention. Isaiah perceived these changes immediately, recognizing them for what they were, not abandonment, but protection. And though the transition carried its own risks, it also offered something he had not dared to expect: space, the possibility of moving through his days without the constant vigilance that proximity had demanded. And while his future remained constrained by the system that defined his life, this recalibration altered the balance enough to grant him a measure of safety he had not possessed before. The enslaved community, informed quietly and cautiously, adjusted in turn, supporting the transition with collective coordination, ensuring that Isaiah's movements appeared routine, that explanations aligned, and that attention was redirected elsewhere, because they understood that endings require as much protection as beginnings, and that the success of this shift depended on communal effort rather than individual action. Neighbors, ever watchful, noted the changes but found nothing to seize upon, because the adjustments had been executed with care, embedded within broader patterns of routine, and without the inconsistencies that had previously fueled speculation. And so the scrutiny gradually eased, attention drifting to other concerns, other households, other whispers. As it always did, Eleanor experienced the aftermath, Aya's role in their lives, because such acknowledgement would have risked unraveling the fragile stability they had achieved. But the knowledge remained, shaping their actions, informing their choices, and reminding them that power carries obligations that cannot be fully discharged through denial. Years later, when the details had blurred and the intensity had softened into memory, what endured was not the secrecy itself, but the understanding it produced, the realization that even within systems designed to deny humanity, moments of recognition can occur, and that what one does with those moments matters. This story, then, does not end with redemption or justice in the way we might wish, but with something quieter and perhaps more honest. A reckoning that limited harm, preserved life, and altered trajectories without overturning the world. A reminder that history is shaped not only by grand gestures, but by careful decisions made in silence. Decisions that determine who survives to see another day. And as we close this chapter, if this story held your attention, challenged your understanding, or stayed with you in its quiet complexity, make sure to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss these untold histories, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story resonated with you, because these narratives, born of silence and survival, deserve to be remembered, discussed, and carried forward.